So Hap Arnold's case is proved. There's a lot more to it, though, than strategic bombing that we don't have time to talk about here. The naval blockade of Japan, the mining of Japan, all sorts of other things put pressure on the Japanese government to surrender. But strategic bombing clearly was a remarkable part of that decision.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Studies of Generalship series on the What's Really Happening podcast. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. On episode 4 of the series, we're going to discuss the case of General Henry Hap Arnold and the implementation of strategic bombing in both the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. Well, welcome back, General, for episode 4 of this great series.
I enjoy doing these, Tad.
So episode 3, we talked about the leader's ability sometimes to fail to adapt to situations, but we're kind of going to pivot here in episode 4 and talk about a leader's vision and their ability to implement that vision, whether they're coming up against obstacles from maybe other officers or maybe even the bureaucracy of the government itself. And, one great point to kick off with that might be the example of General Hap Arnold.
Tad, he's certainly a significant figure in U.S. military history and, in fact, in overall military history. Hap Arnold is the father, really, of the modern United States Air Force. He's the person who brought the vision of the strategic bomber and strategic bombing to the United States, made it a weapon of war in the Second World War, and set the conditions for a separate Air Force at the end of the Second World War. All of that was his vision. And he's one of the most significant characters really in modern American military history. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from him.
And from that vision, how did he come up with it? Was it just his experience? And then how did he start to implement that within the Army Air Corps at the time?
Well, Ted, I think we really need to start with the First World War,
Sure.
where you saw a ground maneuver grind to a halt in the trench warfare of really late 1914 until 1918, where the front line didn't move very much. Human casualties were immense. Economic warfare was waged through naval blockade. But armies struggled to find a way to break through, to get through, to attack the enemy's rear. The British tinkered with tanks at Cambrai. The Germans, the Staatstruppen, the troopers that would infiltrate. So both sides applied remedies on the ground, but ultimately they looked to the sky as another alternative. The idea that you can go beyond the trenches and reach directly to the enemy's homeland to affect his will to fight the war. That was an idea that was born in the First World War. The Germans experimented probably with it more than anyone else. They built the first heavy bomber of the West, the Gotha bomber. It was used against London. The Zeppelins, which were airships that dropped bombs less effectively, were also employed in really what can only be called terror bombing of civilian population in London and other British cities during the First World War. So what happened was you had a concept, but you could never actually carry it through because the technology of the First World War, light airplanes, biplanes, small underpowered aircraft could not carry a heavy bomb load to a place where they could drop that bomb load effectively. Additionally, it was very hard to hit the target from the air. So a lot of factors worked against it. But at the end of the First World War, there was a sense that something new was here in the air. And nations and thinkers struggled to master it. So, Tad, what happened after the First World War was you had a number of thinkers, Duhay in Italy, Billy Mitchell in the United States, and others, all of whom dreamed of air power as an answer to the slaughter of the First World War. The idea that you could strike with precision an enemy's economic system, his homeland, and bring that nation to its knees. Nobody bought into this more than the British, who looked at it and really developed a whole theory of strategic bombardment based on this. In the United States, we also began to experiment with it. The Army Air Corps, which was the expression of U.S. air power after the First World War, conducted a number of experiments. The idea of bombing an enemy's homeland, the whole idea of air doctrine, was kept alive at Maxwell Field in Lower Alabama, L.A. at the Air Corps Tactical School, where instructors thought about how to employ air power deep to affect the fundamental nature of a war. Now, these air power thinkers were bomber-centric. They valued the bomber. They were not particularly enamored with the idea of close support of the Army in the field. And that's a point of tension that actually is to this day in the employment of air power. Air power thinkers tend to think you can apply it as an instrument deep into the enemy's heartland and have great effect. And therefore, you can obviate the need ultimately to even possess an army or a navy. You can do it all with air power. So in the 1930s, we see Germany employ air power really in a very bloody way in the Spanish Civil War with some effect. These lessons are not lost on others. Back in the United States, at the Air Corps Tactical School, thinking began to coalesce around the idea that a strategic bomber armed with a precision bomb sight, a uniquely American idea, it was known as the Norden bomb sight, one of the great secrets, for better or for worse, of the Second World War. The idea that you could apply very strategic fires against carefully identified elements of an enemy's economy and bring that foe to his knees. So it involved target analysis. It involved bombers that would bomb in daylight, because you had to bomb in daylight in order to hit the target, and then very precise bombing. And the idea that the bombers would fly in close proximity to each other to gain protection from their defensive fires. All of this was a uniquely American approach to strategic bombing. And by this time, as we enter the late 1930s, many of these concepts were very well advanced. And by 1940, the United States actually possessed a bomber with the promise to do that, the famous B-17 Flying Fortress. It and the other less known but actually more widely produced B-24 Liberator were the workhorses of our forces in Europe during the Second World War. Meanwhile, the British, looking at the same problem, came to a slightly different approach. They would bomb at night, and while they would probably claim to be using precision bombing techniques, they were not. It was area bombing techniques, and it was really popularized and pressed ultimately by a guy named Sir Arthur Harris, also known as Bomber Harris, who led the RAF's Bomber Command during the Second World War. So you see developing the American school, the British school, but what really pushed it over the edge and made these approaches reality rather than theorizing were the German bombing of British cities during the Battle of Britain in 1940, where Hitler ultimately decided to strike at London, and he struck indiscriminately, bombing at night, wide area. We would call that kind of bombing today counter-value bombing. You're going after the population, essentially, no matter how you choose to characterize it. And that opened the door for Churchill to go back against Germany with a similar campaign. Ultimately, the German campaign will falter. As 1940 turns into 1941, Hitler has to turn his attention to Russia, and Russia consumes German energy, really, for the rest of the war. The German bombing campaign of England falls off. However, the British bombing campaign of Germany only gathers strength because there's really no other way for the British to strike the Germans except through the bomber. And so they began to do that in 1941, 42, and really for the rest of the war. Again, striking at night, striking against area targets rather than precision targets, because you can't do precision bombing at night in the 1940s. And they had some success with this. That the degree of success is still challenged to this day. But nonetheless, that was a uniquely British approach to the problem. The Americans examined the same problem, as we've already noted, and decided they could do it far more precisely. They would bomb in daylight. They would use a very technically sophisticated bomb sight, and they would do nodal analysis, is what we would call it today, to determine where the weak points or the key nodes in the enemy's economy were, and then we would strike those. And so you have two different philosophies of bombing that are applied in Europe. Eventually, the British will put heavy pressure on the Americans to adopt night bombing techniques. Hap Arnold, though, won't buy this. Hap Arnold has a larger vision, a vision that transcends the war with Germany, a vision of what will his aircraft do after the war. In order to do that, he had to maintain independence of action. So he and all his commanders in Europe resisted the British overtures, bomb at night with us, particularly when the early American bombing raids in 1942 were not particularly successful. A lot of aircraft were lost, targets were missed, But the Americans learned, even as the British got better at night bombing, the United States got better at day bombing, until ultimately in Europe, what you see is bombing around the clock, a phrase that Churchill actually used. The British bombed at night, the United States bombed by day. It was a happy confluence of tactics and techniques that put relentless pressure on the Germans that they were never able to resolve. But okay, so this is going on. But Hap Arnold, and here's where we talk about vision. Again, he's seeing beyond this campaign. He's seeing what it's going to look like after the war, and his goal is to establish an independent Air Force. An independent Air Force that would largely be based around the strategic bomber. The Air Force in the Second World, the Army Air Corps, and then the Army Air Service, and then the Army Air Corps, then ultimately the Army Air Forces, and then the U.S. Air Force has never been a particular fan of close-in air support. They prefer to go after what they would describe as deep targets, interdiction targets that can affect the battlefield more directly. Look, we're not going to solve that problem this morning in this podcast. I have a different view of that. But Arnold's view was he had to have this independence in order to establish the Air Force when the war was over.
So with Hap Arnold thinking about, creating independent service, seeing the strategic bombing initiatives within Europe, let's go to the Pacific theater and see kind of what General Curtis LeMay famously taking over some of those bombing and changing that in that other theater.
So Ted, we've been talking about Europe, but actually Hap Arnold saw the opportunity to strike Japan as a case study that would allow him to demonstrate the efficacy of strategic bombing and the fact that you don't actually need to invade someone in order to bring a nation to its knees. To kill nations is a phrase that's used in this context, and I think Hap Arnold was very serious about it. And the weapon that gave him the opportunity to do this was the most expensive weapon developed by the United States in the Second World War. And of course, that's not the atomic bomb. That's the B-29 Superfortress, which an airplane that cost over $3 billion to develop. It alone really had the range to hit Japan from China and from islands in the Western Pacific. The B-17 and the B-24, while very good, very capable airplanes, lacked the range to effectively attack Japan from bases that we had seized during our island campaigns. So what came together was the target of Japan, and then the weapon, the B-29. Originally, the theory was we would bomb from China. This proved to be very difficult. First of all, the logistics of bombing from China required fuel, ammunition, everything, food, everything you ate, used, or applied in warfare to be flown over the hump, over the Himalayas to get into China. An exorbitantly expensive way to wage war. Additionally, the fields in China were never able to be maintained at the level you would really need for these extremely sophisticated B-29 bombers, which were still very much having teething problems during this period of time. Moreover, the Japanese, once we began to strike from China, they actually had large armies in China, and they could operate against those bases. So over time, it became evident that bombing from China, despite being a key idea of Arnold's, was not going to work. So they looked back to the Pacific in order to look at bases that we could actually bomb from. So by late 1944, the islands of Saipan and Tinian are seized by United States Marines and by soldiers. And those would be the first Pacific-based bombing airfields that B-29s could reach Japan from. And so what happens then is we bring in the B-29s to Saipan, we bring them into Tinian, more on Saipan than Tinian, and we begin to strike Japan. And the first commander is going to be a guy named Haywood Hansel, who had fought effectively in Germany. He was a great airpower theoretician. He had lectured in the Air Corps tactical schools. Smart guy, maybe one of the smarter generals of the war. And there were a lot of smart generals in the Air Force during the war. But his plan was to bomb precision at altitude in the same way they used in Europe. A couple of things worked against him here. First of all, flying extremely long ranges to the target from Saipan. The B-29 had engine problems, and those problems were never fully resolved. The airplane was rushed into production. It still suffered from a lot of technical faults. Second, the airplane could fly far higher than the B-17. It was a pressurized aircraft, and bombing at altitudes of 30,000 feet or higher meant that you had a jet stream effect that had not been significant in Europe, but was very significant over Japan. What that means is even if your northern bomb site is able to line up the target, the bombs are going to be pushed aside by the jet stream as they fall. So it became very difficult to conduct precision bombing against Japan. Additionally, weather's bad in Japan a lot of the times. So if the weather's bad, you're not going to be able to do precision bombing. You can't see through the clouds to identify your targets. All of these things worked against Hansel in the initial strikes. He's under very heavy pressure from Arnold because now the show, by the second half of 1944, Germany's falling. It's on its knees. But we have an opportunity, again, to demonstrate we can do this by air alone, without invading Japan. Arnold feels very strongly about this. He puts enormous pressure on Hansel to deliver. Hansel is unable to do this. He is unable to unable to launch the number of missions required. He's unable to have the effects on target that Arnold demands. And so what happens as a result of that is this. In early 1945, Curtis LeMay comes on stage. He was a hard man, and he knew the nature of the problem. And what happens is, of course, Arnold relieves Hansel and puts LeMay in command. So LeMay begins by applying the same tactics and techniques that Hansel did, but he also has the benefit of some analysis that's been done back in the United States. For example, the records of the 1923 earthquake in Tokyo that caused great fires that destroyed the city. A lot of history there about the fragility of Japanese structures and their susceptibility to incendiary weapons. So he applies this, other testing is done, and by March of 1945, LeMay is prepared to make a huge jump that changes everything. First of all, he's going to take those high-flying B-29 bombers. He's going to fly them now at 5,000 feet, much lower. He's going to take out a lot of the self-defense capability of the bomber because at night, now he's going to fly at night now too. So at night, you don't need all the exotic self-defense systems the bomber had at altitude. You're going to take a lot of the crew out of the aircraft. So you're going to fly with a smaller crew. You're going to put more bombs in the aircraft. And now you're going to put different kinds of bombs. You're going to put incendiary bombs on the aircraft. And you're going to fly at a very low altitude. His crews did not want to do this. His group commanders were not happy with this idea. However, on 9 March 1945, LeMay will send 300 bombers to Tokyo. Over 83,000 people are killed. Over 300,000 buildings, more or less, are destroyed. It's one of the most effective bombings of its nature in the war. Probably killed more people than either atomic bomb, all said and done. It's area bombing. And the theory of the case is Japan is a decentralized industrial society. There are a lot of mom and pop places where weapons are put together, and we're going to strike those places. At the same time, though, I don't think Curtis LeMay ever had any doubt he was killing civilians. Mm-hmm. And we were striking at the population of Japan to break them. In the course of the late spring and summer 1945, other cities follow with typical attacks of this nature. And what becomes evident are two things. Casualties are very high on the ground and very effective. And second, far few bombers are lost. Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable breakthrough. What you have now is a vision, Arnold's vision, of having great effect against a nation. And you have an operator who's flying those missions who found the right tactic to apply it, mm-hmm. which was not the vision of precision strikes mm-hmm. that the Air Force entered, the Army Air Corps entered the war with, or actually that they began this particular bombing campaign with. Now, we all know this culminated in the first half of August 1945 when 2 atomic bombs are delivered, the first against Hiroshima, the second against Nagasaki. Look, there's a lot of literature on this. It would fill this room with people having positions on this. I would argue it did have an effect in the Japanese decision to surrender. So Hap Arnold's case is proved. There's a lot more to it, though, than strategic bombing that we don't have time to talk about here. The naval blockade of Japan, the mining of Japan, all sorts of other things had put pressure on the Japanese government to surrender. But strategic bombing clearly was a remarkable part of that decision. And I would further argue that what you see is Hap Arnold's vision, the vision of a separate Air Force, is sustained by the successful campaign. And in fact, is the impetus for what happens to the U.S. Air Force when it's formed a couple of years right after the end of the war.
But one of the lessons from the strategic bombing though would be they still had to occupy Germany to get them to surrender, but the aerial bombing did work in the sense that you did not have to occupy Japan to win. So is there kind of a dual case?
That's why great point, Ted. And that would be my argument that strategic bombing has never proved it can bring you to your knees by itself.
It's a tool.
It's a tool, and but you need to apply multiple tools, and we did actually apply multiple tools against Japan. One of the primary tools was strategic bombing. We applied strategic bombing against Germany. It had effect. It probably had less effect than strategic bombing against Japan for a lot of reasons. The German industry was more robust. They had more effective defenses. Tad, I think the key observation here is just the strength of clarity of vision that Arnold had, his ability to impose it, and the fact that he sort of saw the main thing, which was to demonstrate that air power independently could have a significant effect in modern war. He did that. I think Arnold missed some things too. I think he missed the effectiveness of tactical aviation and what it did when integrated with ground maneuver. But in the big thing, he was right. Strategic bombing became a mainstay of the United States military to this day, Tad, as we talk right now.
Right, because it took someone who like LeMay to adapt a previously ineffective method.
That's correct.
But in the end, still achieving the overall vision of, this case, General Arnold.
You're absolutely right.
Well, we appreciate it, sir, and we look forward to our next episode.
Thanks, Tad. It's always fun to do these.
And that's going to wrap up episode 4 of the Studies of Generalship series on what's really happening. We held an intriguing discussion about the vision and implementation of General Hap Arnold's plan for strategic bombing over the course of World War II. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer with the Global National Security Institute. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to episode 5 when we finish the series here on What's Really Happening.